Thank you, everybody, for participating this evening. I'm Robin with the Ramsey County Historical Society, and we are so pleased to be able to bring you tonight's program with Dr. Jeremy Nienow, talking about his work at the upper post of Fort Snelling. I see that there are a lot of our friends and members here tonight. So if you're not a friend or member of the Ramsey County Historical Society, please consider joining. We rely on the support of all of our wonderful members and friends like you to continue to present all of these programs and all of our other efforts, including Gibbs Farm. And there are some wonderful benefits to joining, including our quarterly magazine, Ramsey County History. I don't know if this is showing up on the screen, but in our spring 2021 issue, which is also available on our website, we had some great stories on Fort Snelling by Jeremy Nienow and Matt Pfluger. So check those out if you haven't got a copy. Again, it's available on our website. But if you join, you receive our quarterly magazine, free admission to Gibbs Farm, and a lot of other benefits, all of which are on our website, rchs.com, which is on the slide on your screen. On October 21st at 7 o'clock, we have a very special History Revealed program with well-known author and historian Bill Lindeke, who will be sharing his new book, St. Paul, an Urban Biography, which is a really great book. This will also be an online program, so see the website for more details and Zoom registration. As a reminder, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off during the program. You can type your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll read the questions out loud for Dr. Nienow to answer. So again, this program is being recorded, and hopefully it will be up on our Ramsey County Historical Society YouTube channel in a week or so. We would like to acknowledge this sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of the Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website on your screen, rchs.com, which includes actionable ways in which Ramsey County Historical Society pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota and Makoche. We are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and I'm really excited to bring you tonight's program. I love Fort Snelling and Fort Snelling State Park. So I'd like to thank our presenter tonight, Jeremy Nienow, Ph.D., RPA. Jeremy is a registered professional archaeologist focused on the historical archaeology in the upper Midwest. He has 30 years of archaeological experience and is the owner of Nienow Cultural Consultants LLC. And I want to give one other small plug. Jeremy has recently finished several 360-degree virtual tours for us, including the St. Paul City Hall, which is the Ramsey County Courthouse as well. And we just finished and just uploaded a new 360-degree tour on the Union Depot. So thank you, Jeremy, for all your work for us and for everyone else. And I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great. All right, I'll share my screen. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'll bring up the presentation here. Hopefully everyone can see it, and maybe Robin will just acknowledge that she can see it as we move through here. I'm going to be talking. Does it look good? Okay, good, fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to be talking informally this evening about something that a lot of you may not know too much about, which is the construction process that's going on currently in the upper post area at Fort Snelling. I'll be talking about it from my perspective as the archaeologist whose task it is to make sure that archaeological resources that we have previously found are being protected during this process, and is also in the advent of unanticipated discoveries that we approach those in a meaningful way. We learn from them what we can as we move through the construction process. I want to start by acknowledging and thanking all the partners that are part of this process. There have been days out on the fort where I am Monday through Friday, starting at 6 a.m. in the morning until sometimes 6 p.m. at night. And we've got sometimes up to 200 people that are working in the various trades out there doing work right now. The project itself is being run by Weiss Builders and with generous partners from Dominium, and I'll be talking about a few of those individuals tonight. And then I myself am working with a very talented team of sub-consultants who are doing archaeological and structure monitoring along with me. So it'll be an informal talk. I'll just kind of go through and tell some stories about the process and what I'm doing out there and what we're learning. I won't be sharing a lot of information yet about the artifacts and other things that we have been finding throughout this process, but I'll be giving some general observations about what's been going on and what we're learning along the way. All right, so hopefully I can get this to move to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so the fort is essentially getting a facelift and is starting a new chapter in its long and storied history, leading up to this point where it was and always has been an historic district. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's a National Historic Landmark. And now through a process, there's a company called Fort Snelling Leased Housing Associates, which is a corporation involving Dominium and a few other individuals. They're using federal and state historic tax credits to develop this parcel into a series of apartments. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. It is that process of using federal and state historic tax credits that brings me into the process. And I've been working on this since 2018. The use of federal funding in projects like this one triggers the National Historic Preservation Act, specifically Section 106 of that process, which says that essentially development which involves historic or involves federal fundings and is an undertaking on the landscape must consider cultural resources in its development. So that is why I'm out here doing this work. And of course, it's an amazing site that has a lot of its own history. It's a no-brainer that we would be involved. And we've had a very good relationship with not only the builders that are out there doing the work on a daily basis, but also the new leaseholders, Dominium and others, who are looking forward to operating this facility once it is complete. Fort Snelling itself is, the process itself is using a lot of individuals to get this process done. We're working a lot with Minnesota DNR. We're working with the county. We're working with SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. We're working with national parks. A lot of individuals are involved in this process. At the end of the day, all the properties that are still remaining, there's 26 buildings, and we'll go through those as we go here. Those buildings are going to be rehabilitated back to a state where they can be turned into affordable housing units. Approximately 200 units will be there. And some of those will be affordable housing, and they will be opened to preference to qualified applicants that have background in service to the United States in a veteran capacity. So it's a very interesting and exciting project. There have been multiple attempts to do this in the past. This one finally went over all of the hurdles and got to this point, and it's definitely in full swing now. And I'm sure as I talk, and I'll be in awe several times, where having been out at the fort now for many years and seeing the process that's undergoing, it's like a brand new place in a lot of ways. Being able to see through the property, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, by having actually just brush and things cleared away, being able to see sight lines to buildings that I could never see before when I was out there doing my work. It's a pretty amazing process, and seeing these buildings come back to life and the work that's being done by the construction trades and by the new leaser is fantastic. And I'm really honored to be a part of this process. So tonight we're going to look at a couple different things. I've been told I have 5 or 6 hours that I can talk to you guys. So settle in, get some popcorn and things, but hopefully we'll have about a 45-minute presentation here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Fort Snelling itself. I think a lot of you already know a lot about Fort Snelling, but I'll orient you to where we are inside the fort itself, because a lot of you are really familiar with lower post. We're going to be talking about upper post. They don't talk a lot about the process called cultural resource management, or CRM, which is what archaeologists, business side archaeologists do. Opposite of research archaeology, this is compliance archaeology, working with things like the National Historic Preservation Act to make sure that our cultural resources are protected. So that's my job. So we'll talk about that. And then I'll talk generally about what we're finding when we're out there. All right, so I think a lot of you already know an awful lot about historic Fort Snelling, and you're really familiar with it. You're all familiar with the round tower. I have a mouse here as well. Hopefully you guys can see my cursor. I made it nice and big, but you're all familiar with the round tower. This is one of the most, I think, impressive and well-known places in Minnesota, especially in the metro area. It is at Badote, the location of the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, and I'll show you a map and things in a little bit. Most people are familiar with the fact that this fort was set up as the United States was coming into control of the Mississippi headwaters, and we had other forts going in place in Illinois and moving up into Wisconsin. We set up a location here after Pike came through and said, this is a fantastic place. We should really think about doing it. So in 1819 and 1820, they started doing construction on the fort, and the fort was around for 146 years. And then finally was decommissioned. And really the fort itself went through periods of, and this is, you can read about this in Osborne's books and in other places, where individuals would invest a lot of money and time and effort in the fort, build lots of buildings, have lots of people training, and then we would cool down between wars, and the place would, potentially be resold back to private individuals to make communities. And then we'd go into another hot war, whether it was a civil war or a world war. And then we would build things back up again, up at the fort, and then we'd go back down. So it's really had this punctuated life history, which is fascinating. And we're going to be looking at the large growth of that over time and really looking at that on the landscape and talking about the upper post itself. But eventually the post was decommissioned in 1946 after World War II. And it was used, some of its buildings were used by the VA and others. It was actually some civilian housing for a while. There were training activities and things that were going on in some of the buildings. This was federal land, and the fort itself is really hard to address when you get out there because it's not really part of any municipality. It's on its own and sort of in unorganized territory out there. But it was eventually transferred through the federal surplus process to Minnesota, and the lower fort area that we all know, the historic fort, is managed by the Minnesota Historical Society. The upper post area is actually managed by the DNR. So it's a whole another entity. And I will say that lower post is by and large one of the most excavated places in Minnesota, hands down. The reason for that, of course, was the reconstruction process of putting back up all the walls, and many of the buildings that we see in the lower post were reconstructed. And before they did that, they did archaeology in those locations beginning in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And Chuck Deason and many other well-known archaeologists worked out almost their entire careers in that place. And upper post didn't get that done to it. So it's been relatively calm and quiet out there. So here's a map that I wanted to show folks. And I'm going to try and minimize this so that I don't see. Oh, I'm going to go back a second. Minimize that little thing. I have a little thing that was blocking what I could see. So this down here in the very corner, there's the round tower that we're all familiar with, that 1820 building. And here is where the new MHS building for its interpretive history center is going to be at, right there, building 18. The old visitor center used to be right here, and then that was demolished. It was connected to this building here. But this is the fort area that many of you know when you come along Highway 5 and 55 and things that are cutting through. People are really familiar with this. You go across over into St. Paul right here. But this map, which is from the Veterans Administration from the 1960s, shows you that this is only one very small part of Fort Snelling. We're all like, oh, this is Fort Snelling. Well, yeah, it's a little bit of Fort Snelling, but here's the rest of Fort Snelling. It's a really big area. And the area that we're going to be talking about tonight is right here, this area of Upper Post, which after, they grew out of this after the Civil War, beginning and moving into the 1870s and the 1880s, they started to move and approach and go this direction. And today, starting right here, all of this is now within the airport. So all of this is gone. And many of these buildings are also gone. The federal building and things are over here now as well. But this was a huge sprawling complex at Bdote, at the confluence of the two rivers here, that didn't just include the lower historic fort that everyone knows and loves, but this larger, huge area that had infantry barracks, a post headquarters, a series of administrative buildings, including a hospital and a morgue and a place for the band and a movie theater and a gymnasium, a lot of stuff. And then housing. So married family quarters, officer quarters, married officer quarters, bachelor officer quarters. So there was a lot of the fort that was out here, not just the great little historic fort. So that gives you a little bit of context. Now I'll show you, here's the topo map that shows sort of what the landscape looks like today. This is itself getting a little bit dated. This is from 1993, this topo map. But what it shows you is here again is the historic fort that everyone knows right here. And these, of course, these purple building things show that these have been rebuilt. So these are parts of the reconstruction effort that were completed, of course, long before 1993. Here we have the crazy intersections of 5 and 55 going through here, going along the bluff edge. Here, of course, is Fort Snelling State Park down below. And then this is the area that we'll be talking about today, Upper Post, with some of the barracks buildings, the infantry barracks still there, Officers Row. These two buildings right here are for the golf course that's right there. And then this is the airport that's out over here as well. So a lot of change, but the fort did at one time incorporate all of this landscape before the airport and before the highways came in. And really, the reason I like to talk about Lower Post and the reason people all know it really well is because when these construction efforts were getting started and they realized that they were going to go through this historic place with one of the, the oldest buildings in Minnesota still standing, 1820 of the Round Tower. Right at that point, we were, as a country, as a nation, just coming to grips with the idea of preserving our history. And so it shouldn't come as no surprise that right when the National Historic Preservation Act is being passed, we are getting behind the idea of preserving and reconstructing and rebuilding the Lower Post. And we have lots of excitement around this, and archaeology gets done. And all of these things get sort of forgotten at that point. So we definitely focused in here. We did not focus over here. All right, so what's left today? So at this point, the Upper Post area is comprised of 26 buildings. And this is actually the map that I use every day when I'm out on post orienting people to the landscape. This shows a little bit of the construction plan and idea. The buildings that are in orange are housing part of those 191 units that are going to be made. And then we have a common building, a leasing building that's right here. But essentially all of the buildings, the 26 buildings that are on the fort area in the Upper Post are all going to be turned into various levels, amounts of units. And then these are all have the building numbers on them. So building like 101, 102, 103, these are the infantry barracks. These were some of the second buildings that are built up here. So we started by building places like the post headquarters in 1879. And then in the mid 1880s, building infantry barracks, then building support structures like the bakery, and then building Officers Row. Of course, we have the hospital and things. And this is only a small sliver of the buildings that used to be present. I'll show you a map in a little bit that shows some of the other buildings that were on the post as well. But these are the ones that are still here today. There are 26 buildings left, and they're all part of this large process of making them into historic housing for individuals. And again, the airport is right there. It is loud. at times. I'll say it's definitely, there's a lot of planes coming up. There's also the golf course right here. There's the soccer fields. If you go off the building to the north, you get to where the boys, the scouts and things are up that way. It's a really beautiful area. And then of course, the state park is right down here as well. So it's really lovely and it's a wonderful place to be. Yeah, so that this shows you not only the building numbers that we talk about, but also when the buildings were built. And let me just back up for just a moment. On this map, you can still see that there is a 27th building that's right here. This is the quartermaster building that was still around when this topo map was done in 1993. However, about 13 years later, it collapsed and you'll see it is not present anymore. It is a ruins that's right here currently. So that is not being rehabilitated as part of this process. The quartermaster's building is no more. Okay, so before this process got started, so these are some of my first shots coming out here in 2018. In 2018, when this project was first getting rolling, the fort essentially was a abandoned place. There was a lot of graffiti. There were vagrants and other individuals had broken into a lot of the properties and were hanging out in them. There was some fencing that had been put up by the DNR to keep people out of some portions of the properties. They would just basically cut into locks and things like that to get into them. But it was quiet, it was peaceful. It was a great place for doing art. If you liked woodchucks, there were a lot of woodchucks that were out here, but it was overgrown, it was dense, but also, and this is one of the things that people don't necessarily know, is that it is also a dangerous place from an asbestos perspective and a lead perspective. All of the beautiful buildings that used to be here when they were being used by the military got painted with lead paint. And that lead paint would come off the buildings and then during rain and wet, and it would get down into the landscape. So all of the soil surrounding the buildings has a lot of lead in it. And that is being remediated as part of the process also for coming out here. But the buildings themselves also have a lot of asbestos used as insulation inside of them. And so it was a dangerous place. And so there was one of the reasons why you couldn't get into the buildings themselves is because they were harmful to you. It was not people didn't realize that they were actually hurting their health by breaking into these spaces and getting into them. But just before construction started, it was an overgrown, forgotten landscape. So how did I get started? So in 2018, I was part of a team which involved architectural historians from Hess Royce, the National Park Service, the State Historic Preservation Office, the lease holding tenant, and they had this idea of going through the tax credit process to rehabilitate these and turn them into housing units. So before that could happen, as part of the 106 process, we had to better understand what was there from an archaeological perspective. So the first thing that we did is we started doing something called shovel testing, where every 50 feet or 15 meters, I would have a team out with a screen and a shovel, and they would basically be digging a hole that's about the size of a pizza box, and they'd go down 3 feet, they'd screen all the soil, and they would look for artifacts. We knew, obviously, because the buildings are there, and we knew quite a bit about the history of the place, and we had done our due diligence by doing a lot of research and maps, and I worked with a lot of great people like Matt Pfluger to learn a lot about the fort's history from a document perspective. We started going on a landscape and basically digging a lot of holes and seeing what was still there beneath the ground. As that process continued and we dug hundreds of shovel tests, we then moved into the second process, which was when we would find things of interest, foundations to old buildings or features in the landscape, we would do additional archaeology in the form of excavation units, which are 6 foot by 3 foot rectangles, dug at a very slow pace of basically 4 inches, between 2 and 4 inches at a time, screening all those materials. This is a picture down here of individuals doing an excavation unit behind one of the buildings right there. That's the guardhouse, building 65. So as they were doing that work, we would document and find things, and all of this information on a regular basis was being turned over to all the other partners, who are then working with people doing construction design to figure out, okay, where are all the new utilities going to go? Where are the roads going to go? How are we going to put things up to code? And how do we do that in a landscape where there's a lot of archaeology present? How do we both protect the archaeological resources that are present and make this place habitable for people to live in? We also had to do lots of interesting and not so fun things. For example, we knew that the soil in some places had a lot of lead in it. So we had to wear these Oompa Loompa outfits, our Tyvek suits, put on gloves, put on masks. We didn't want to get any of the dust or anything into our lungs. And so there were times on the fort where it was very hot and you're wearing a Tyvek suit and you're sweating. But we had a good time with it. We enjoyed it. So in 2018 and 2019, I spent 2 years out at the fort. I was also at the same time that was going on doing some work at lower post as part of the building a new visitor center out there. So I was doing lower post excavations as well. I did phase 1 and phase 2, or identification and evaluation work out there. But then we switched to upper post as a whole different project. Went from working with the Minnesota Historical Society to working with the Department of Natural Resources, two great managers of the landscape and two very different missions that they were undertaking. And we provided all of the archaeological knowledge back to the clients and back to the historical societies, back to the historic preservation offices and the construction design teams. And what we learned essentially, and this is a very busy map, and I apologize, there's a lot going on in this map, but essentially, this is where there's an aerial image that shows, here's the infantry barracks, here's the officers row, airport is over here. All these little dots represent shovel tests, those little locations. Some of the larger squares show we had test excavation units. What we found is that there is a Native American presence along what is now the edge of the bluff for the highway down here. Once upon a time, this was all bluff, the edge, so that went way down here, but that's been removed for the highway construction. And we found that there is still a archaic, so 5,000 to 7,000 year old Native American archaeological component, which is up on this part of the bluff. And then on top of that, so that's mostly along the bluff edge, on top of that is laid over, if you will, an historic fort landscape, which includes buildings that no longer exist, all the buildings in blue. So here are buildings for enlisted man family buildings. We have some garages. We have the quartermaster's building. We've got a former band building before this band building was built. Another garage. So these blue buildings are all also there in some form on the landscape. We also did ground penetrating radar. That's what these hashes show, to see where we can figure out where features are at from other buildings. So we learned that yes, there is Native American presence there and an historic Euro-American presence, all overlapping in the landscape. And those things need to be protected while construction is going on. So that brings us up to the construction process. So what are we doing in construction? And I have an awful lot of pictures here, and I'll try to talk through them as best I can. But our goal as monitors of construction is essentially to do anytime there's ground disturbing activities that are taking place in this part of the fort where the Native American presence is at, and a lot of these historic buildings were there. They're no longer on the landscape above ground. That is our primary monitoring corridor. That's where we're spending most of our time. If there is a ground disturbing activity going on, and I'll talk about what those are, we will have a person out there, like this right here is John Strott from John Strott's Archaeological Consulting. And he'll be out on site watching the monitoring the ground disturbing activity. And if something is found that is out of what we expected, John will stop construction. He'll then give me a call if I'm not on site. And I, as the managing archaeologist, the principal investigator, will determine what this feature that we run into is, and is it something that we need to protect? And if it is something we need to protect, how do we go about protecting it? Usually the way to protect it is to avoid it, is to do construction in another place. Sometimes though, you have to put your construction through that location, or the size of the construction you're doing is just too large that it's still going to impact it, in which case we do archaeology or other ways to document it before it is removed. So the construction monitoring process starts with the archaeologist out in the field, talking every single day with the managers of the project and the hundreds of people that are out there doing the work. We mostly work with 3 companies, Pete's Water Service or PWS, Medina Electric, and Ramsey companies. They're the ones doing most of the ground disturbing activities. I have weekly construction meetings with all these fine people talking about what is going on this week, what ground disturbing activity do they have. My day starts really early in the morning. I get up at 5 o'clock every day. I'm out on site by 6:30. It used to be 6 o'clock, but then it's getting darker and darker in the mornings. So now we get out there at 6:30. Soon I hope it'll go to 7 o'clock. But we get out there right when the sun is coming up. We're meeting with people, finding out what they're doing that day, walking the site with them, and then monitoring their activities. And then if unanticipated discoveries are found, and I'll talk about an example of one of those in just a little bit, then I'm called in and we move forward with the process from there. We also have a similar process if we were to find human remains. We have not found any human remains at all during this construction process, nor do we expect to. One of the things that I've always found of interest is that if you ever wonder when you're driving along, there's a lot of construction going on right now in the Twin Cities, you see an awful lot of people doing the construction. And a lot of times you see them standing around and you don't actually see a lot of people actually working. And that always amazed me. I was like, what are all these people doing? There's one person working and there's 5 people standing around. It's like a classic joke. Well, in our case, I know what those people are doing. A lot of them are supervisors documenting the process. One person's the operator actually doing the work. You have a construction monitor, you have an OSHA person out there, you have an archaeological monitor that's out there. There's a lot of people involved with every single activity. So it's given me a really new appreciation of how construction is done and to be a part of this process. All right, so here's an example just briefly about an unanticipated discovery. So essentially we are standing just behind buildings 102 and 101 and 102. We're on a portion of Sibley. So this is a black and white historic image. This is actually the trolley line that used to run through the fort. This is a shot of building 102, a barracks that's out there. And there's a road that's going across the trolley line here, and then that goes across right directly to building 101. But there's also this little bridge going across a ditch that was put in the 1930s by the WPA to do help with drainage on site. And there's a little bridge that goes over it. And while we were out removing the concrete for Sibley, the building team that I'm working with from Pete's Water Service or PWS, and they see things and feel things faster than we do. I'll have an archaeological monitor or myself standing right there with them, and they'll stop construction and say something doesn't feel right. In this case, they were ripping up portions of the Sibley Road because this is where all the utilities are going to go in, and I'm going to show some amazing, scary pictures of utility work. It is a very intense process. But as they're removing this, they came across a limestone pathway that's about 3 feet wide. It's only about a foot deep, and it's mortared together limestone. And all it is it's a pathway that goes across. The ditch is now overgrown and it's right here. That bridge would have been right behind it. We didn't have any idea that this walkway existed. It's a resource on the landscape. We documented it. We looked for artifacts on both sides of it. We figured out from historic photographs, that thanks to Matt Pfluger, that this is connected right in this exact spot. So this is an example of the construction team doing its job, finding an unanticipated discovery. We then document that discovery and we move forward with the work. Now, if this had been a resource or a feature that had the ability to answer lots of research questions about what was going on at the fort and had a lot of artifacts associated with it and had a lot of datable materials, we would have had to figure out a different way to go around doing our work. But because we knew what it was and we documented it, and it was just a couple courses of limestone for this path, and we figured out what its function was, we were allowed to continue going through the process. All right, so what are the kinds of activities that I'm watching out there? What are ground disturbing activities like? So I have a series of 6 of them here. They kind of fall into some general categories. We're going to go through each of these: removals, temporary activities, landscape changes, external building improvements, new utilities, and then a catch-all I have at the bottom. but it is this new utilities one here that you're going to see is the largest ground disturbance going on out there. But of all of these landscape changes to the landscape are the ones that I think are the most interesting to see, because they really open up the fort and allow us to see parts of it that really we haven't been able to appreciate in ever since it was decommissioned as a fort, really. All right, so removals. So what are removals? So removals are essentially, there's a lot of hard surface, weathered, concrete, sidewalks, and other things that are either on top of where utilities are going to go, or they're unsafe and cracked. And so they are removed as part of the first activities of construction. This was actually put even before tree removal. Normally we would have been doing tree removal out on site, the first thing we did. However, we wanted to protect migratory birds that are moving through at a certain period of time. And we had bats that may or may not have been living in some of the trees. And so we wanted to give them a nesting period. So we worked with the DNR to figure out when it would be appropriate to be able to start cutting down trees on the post. And we had to wait several months into the construction process. So we started with removals first. And here I have my construction monitors doing their work. I've got people in track vehicles removing sidewalk, or big vehicles smashing up concrete. Currently there's a big concrete pile right behind the barracks. They're actually going to be reusing all of that concrete and making it into new concrete and using that to pour all the other surfaces on the site. A lot of the fixtures, doors, window sashes, things like that are being removed, cleaned and processed and put back as best they can. And concrete and other things are being reused. Light fixtures are being reused. There's a lot of reuse to continue to have that historic fabric, which is very important to this landscape, to continue to have that moving forward out there. So removals has basically, it's the surface stuff and then ground disturbance immediately around the surface. We haven't found an awful lot during the removals process. That first unanticipated discovery I told you about is an example of something that was right underneath the landscape. We've also found some examples of drainage, changes in drainage that we didn't know about, that they were filling in for roads. And of course, as you'll see in a little bit later, we found an awful lot of utilities that we didn't really know about going into the project that we found through the removal process. The next one is a sort of a catch-all called temporary activities. So we have to have power to the buildings in order to do a lot of construction activities out there. So we have to put a temporary power. So here's a temporary power trench being dug away from the building to a temporary power pole back here. And this is my monitor carefully watching the process happening. Another example of that. Other times here is a situation where there is an existing concrete stairwell that has been buckled over time. And so they are removing dirt away from that with a small, this is a small excavator, with the toothed bucket. They're removing the soil away temporarily so they can shore this up, and then they'll put the soil right back. And every time they're doing major excavations out there, it's very important that we follow OSHA regulations and we slope all of these so people can get easily in and out of them and they stay out of danger. If you cannot slope a trench successfully, you have to put a box down in there to let people work, and you'll see some pictures of some of that in a little bit moving forward. So temporary activities is another example of a ground disturbing activity. But you can also already see in this picture here, all that's left is the oak savanna around here, and a lot of the shrubbery that you saw in those earlier pictures has already been removed. Here where the band building is behind us, and in the foreground, this is the housing for the individual who ran the hospital, and there's the hospital in the background behind him. Now, this is the gymnasium up here. This is where at the very, very northern end of the project area. This is about middle of the way through the project area. So landscape changes, the third thing here, I think is one of the most amazing and dramatic things to see. Essentially, they're removing a lot of the trees and things that have grown up over time. When you look at early historic pictures of the fort, it doesn't have a lot of trees on it. It doesn't have a lot of landscaping on it. There were large open lawns for people to be active out on, to do drill, to do practice, to do dress. So you didn't have those things in the landscape. So over time, the landscape became so overgrown that some buildings you couldn't even hardly see. So this is building 151 right here, which is the bachelor officers' quarters. And this building was oftentimes called the hidden building because all trees had grown up so much around it, you couldn't even see it. as you drove along Leavenworth here to go to the golf course right over this way, you drive right past this building. And unless you looked over at it, you'd be like, you just thought it was a clump of trees that was over there. So it was completely hidden. We've along the bluff, especially, there's a huge machine that's back there shredding and mulching up all the material. This is one of the activities that we actually cannot watch as it is happening. The machine that grubs and shreds these big, huge trees out there is so dangerous that we can't be out watching them do the activity. We have to wait until the next day, and then we come back across the landscape and we see all kinds of things that we didn't know before. One of the more interesting things that we've been able to find out on the fort as this ground grubbing process has taken place is we knew that they used to have a series of garages out there for putting in cars and things like that. We knew from quartermaster's records that these garages were relatively shoddily built. They just had a cinder block foundation that was maybe 2 feet deep, and then just a rough either crushed rock floor or a pad for a brief period of time. And that's really it. I mean, they're wood construction, pretty basic garages. And we thought that there wasn't any remnants of some of these garages left because we couldn't see them at all on the landscape. We didn't hit them when we were doing archaeology. But here are 2 examples of garages that we actually found out there. This is the garage for building 69. This is all that's left is this cinder block wall that we never would have seen unless the grubbing process hadn't been done. And here is another one of the consultants, Fred Sutherland, exposing portions of another garage that's right behind the infantry barracks that, again, we wouldn't have seen if this landscape process hadn't been going on. And every day when I'm out there with other contractors and we're walking across the landscape, we see new viewpoints that we never saw before because of the tree removal process. It's pretty dramatic. All right, well, another one of the ground disturbing activities that are going on are external building improvements. So the buildings themselves, we have a lot of brickwork that's going on constantly, and all the bricks are being redone. A lot of them get picked out and then put back in and then remortared, and they have to match the mortar exactly with historic things, and they got to have the right kind of brick out there. So SHPO has been really good in those things. But then we have lots of places where the foundations are in really bad shape. This is the old Telegraph building. And so we've had to pull away soil back and make this safe for somebody to get in there. So you have to move it 8 feet away from the building, slope it up so the person can get in there to do their work. Another example of an external building improvement, besides new stairs and steps and both down and up going into buildings, are window wells and being able to get out of these window wells. So if you have a basement apartment or you have a bedroom in a basement, you have to have a way to get out of that besides going out the one door. And so we have these special breakaway window emplacements that are being built. And that's a huge improvement to the buildings that didn't exist before. There were just window wells back here and there wasn't any way to get out of the building at this point. So these kinds of improvements, of course, is a big ground disturbing activity near the building. We have to monitor it in the process of them doing their work. Next up, we have new utilities. And this is, these are some big pictures to try to understand what's going on in the landscape. We have very large excavator machines. There's a person standing here. Here's the big excavator. Here's one of these boxes where the trenches, if you can't slope the sides necessarily, you have to put this box trench in to make it safe for people to work. But we have huge amounts of soil removal that are going on and moving. We are exposing old utilities so that we can reuse them. So this is some old utility that's a stormwater, sanitary sewer that are being replaced. So we have big teams out here. And this is the activity that I have people, or I myself, monitor every single day that we're out there. New utility work is the #1 largest ground disturbing activity going on at the fort. And this is the thing that we watch closely every day. I have a couple more pictures here just to give you the idea of the size and magnitude of these things. Again, you see they have to do these big slopes. So even though you're putting in, this is a blue, of course, so this is water. This is a hookup going into one of the, so there's a water line that's out here along Sibley. This is the back of one of the infantry barracks. They're going to be connecting it into the building. This is a huge excavating machine. A person sits right there and excavates out with these 3-foot across buckets. you have to do. So even if you have this small pipe at the bottom, because you're going so far down into the ground, you have to have these slopes so that people can walk out of these trenches without the trench collapsing on them. So even though you're only putting in a small pipe, you have a huge V construction of destructive process going on. And we had to make sure ahead of time by doing archaeology and then continuing to monitor them to make sure they don't impact cultural resources. Sometimes, of course, we find other utilities that were already put in these places. This is an example of a shared utility trench. I'll show you a picture of one of these in just a little while longer. So he's building the V, he's digging the V trench. He's going right alongside of a utility. And we have a general understanding with the State Historic Preservation Office that as part of this process, any existing historic utility that we don't have to move, we're gonna leave in the ground and leave in place. Only when a utility comes into contact with a new utility will that utility be removed so that we can put in the new utility. But we are, to the best of everyone's ability, maintaining the historic fabric of the fort. All right, the final is a catch-all thing. And so I primarily, 99% of the time, I'm only working outdoors. I'm not doing any work inside the buildings. That's architectural historians' work. It's not archaeologists' work. But every once in a while, something strange happens. And so I was out working on fort one day with Fred Sutherland again, right here. And I get a call from the building construction manager saying, we found something strange in the basement of one of the buildings. We'd like you to come and take a look at it. And I said, I'm sorry, that's not my job. I don't go in the buildings. And he said, okay, how do we get you involved? And I said, talk to the architectural historian, see if they want me to be involved. So then 20 minutes goes by, he calls me back and said, hey, the architectural historian says you could come look at this. So we went down to the basement of the building. They had just started to expose. So this is the floor below concrete. And this was all filled in at the time. And I've excavated this out since then. But there was this very strange, there was a circular brick-lined feature with a tab coming off over here. It had rebar reinforcement on one end. And we excavated it. It had coal, clinker. It had some alcohol bottles that had been stashed in it. It had some broken lamp parts inside of it. We were inside of this building. So here's again, the original blueprint for that building. Again, thanks to Matt Pfluger for providing this from all of his hard work out in DC. We were in and looking at this blueprint. There used to be a stairs that went down right here, which is actually bricked up in this picture right here. And this was into the furnace room. So we then went back and we started looking up what are appropriate furnaces for the period of construction for this building, right at the turn of the century, the 19th into the 20th century. We consulted a series of encyclopedias called the Encyclopedia of Architecture, Carpentry, and Building. And in one of the volumes, which is specifically about furnaces, we found that there's a particular kind of furnace that has a circular base with a cold air draft trench next to it to bring in air. And we think that this is exactly the kind of furnace that they had in here. So even though we don't have other documents, we have a blueprint that says the furnace was down in here, but doesn't show where the furnace was. We just know we were in the furnace room. And we have this feature that's left. So archaeologists deal with features in the landscape. We excavated this. Of course, we were wearing our N95 masks down in here because this is still going through the process of lead and asbestos remediation at the time that we did this work. And we're pretty certain that this is the kind of furnace that we found there. So that was a really interesting thing that didn't have to do with construction monitoring as I expected it, but fun nonetheless. All right, so now in the time, I just have a little bit of time left here to talk about my general observations of what we've learned so far in the process. And I really have three major things to talk about. One is that we are learning a little bit more about the kinds of things that people left behind. And depending upon if you are in a building or if you are outside the buildings, like where a lot of my work is being done, you're learning two very different stories. Second is that we're going to tell you a lot about utilities, and we're finding lots of interesting utilities. And three, that there was a lot of landscape manipulation that was going on by the people running the fort. So every day, not every day, I shouldn't say that. In the beginning, it was every day. I'd be out working, walking on the site, and I would have somebody in the trades, because in the first couple of months of the process where we started on the infantry barracks, buildings 101, 102, 103, and they were doing initial demolition inside of those buildings. They're removing walling, they're taking down old studs and things like that so they can do repairs. And in the walls and up in the rafters, they were finding all kinds of interesting things. Letters to home, medicines, newspapers, cigarettes, lots of evocative symbols of the past that the soldiers left behind, stuffed into these places, dog tags, things like that. So every time one of these things gets brought to my attention, and I have a box that's in the trailer over there, these things get put into the box. The information of where it came from is carefully recorded, if possible, from the individual. And sometimes I'm not there to take down, and sometimes they don't. They say, "Oh yeah, I think it was in this building," so that's all we get. But these items are being carefully preserved. They're in amazing condition by and large, and they're being photographed, documented, and they'll all be turned over to the Minnesota Historical Society as part of the curation agreement that I have to have in order to have my license to do my archaeology work out there. I am licensed by the state archaeologist in Minnesota to be doing this construction monitoring process. I'm also licensed and have a permit from the Department of Natural Resources to be doing a research project out on lands that the DNR technically oversees for the state of Minnesota, even though it is being leased for 99 years to the folks that are doing the rehabilitation project. But my license says that we need to turn over all artifacts, and that's what we're doing. We're turning over these diagnostic materials at the end of the project. So inside the buildings, we're finding e-tools, trays, bottles, letters, receipts, all kinds of interesting things from the entire time period of the buildings themselves. And those are fantastic. And they really, you can tell the individuals that are working on the properties, they're seeing things that really spark for them a sense of history. They get excited, they come find me. They're really keen on it. Also, the background of this is actually a computer training board that was found in one of the buildings. They're basically teaching soldiers at the end of the fort's use how to work on the first IBM computers. And this is an early computer training board. We actually have the manual. We were able to find online the manual that goes directly with this board because it had a little serial number on it. So we're getting all kinds of interesting enigmatic things that are coming out of the buildings that I really don't see the process of them being removed. I only get them after the fact. Outside the buildings, the number one thing that I find on a regular basis are utilities. And people are like, okay, big deal, utilities. Well, some of these utilities, nobody ever saw on a map. Oftentimes when people are putting in new utilities, and utilities are things like sanitary, so your wastewater for your toilets and things, but also stormwater pipes, also electrical lines, gas lines, telecommunications, so phone and things like that. We have a lot of these different lines and utilities that went across, so crisscross the landscape that we just didn't know about. People didn't put down on paper, on maps, a lot of times when these things were going in. So some of these utilities, here's an example of that shared utility, concrete, a portion of another area where they basically dug a trench, put a series of utilities for conduit for telephone and electrical, and then filled the whole thing in with concrete. That's a pretty big one on the landscape. This is a maintenance box for another set of telecommunications. But here is actually an early telephone line going in, and the conduit box to protect this was actually made out of wood. Normally, we have a lot of lead, cast iron, ceramic, those kinds of pipe going in. But for this early telephone, which is basically covered in sap, wrapped in lead. So again, we don't get to play with it because it's covered in lead. And then it was put inside of a wooden box. And we've seen two places on the fort where we've actually seen these early telephone conduit being laid down. So that's pretty interesting. A lot of times though, the utility stuff is dangerous health-wise. This stuff right here is asbestos. It's asbestos concrete pipe, and it is not fun to play with. And of course, it does get broken in this process, and it has to be sorted out, and it has to be disposed of. A lot of times, my soils, the guys that are doing soil work out there are also working with Braun. which is a soil company here, to figure out what soils are hot and which soils are not, and which soils can be put back in the ground and which things have to leave site and move on. And there's a lot of that soil that's being removed from the site because of lead contamination. All right, so finally, we're finding out. So inside, we're finding lots of enigmatic, really cool things, right? We get the dog tags, we get the letters from to home, we get the receipts, we get the cigarettes shoved in behind the wall so that the guy, you know, sergeant doesn't see you smoking a cigarette out there. Outside, the landscape clearly looked very different in the past, and they were filling it constantly, building up the landscape and putting a lot of their rubbish and their debris, burying it in the ground. And so when we're out, and here's an example of a utility trench underneath where Sibley Avenue is, this is the construction box, here's the excavator. You go down a foot and a half, and here is this bright lens of ash and coal and clinker, because it turns out we are, once again, if you remember that picture I had from before of that furnace, we're right outside of the guardhouse building. And that is right outside the doors to where that furnace basement entrance and exit was. They would basically come out, clean that stuff, and dump it out into the road. And they were building up their landscape behind the buildings. This is another place on Fort where down at this layer right here, there's basically an entire lens of broken up ash and brick and other kinds of rubbish and debris that's in there. And then in another place on Fort, when we were out there doing our phase 2 excavations, this is a shot of Anastasia Walhoff, who's now doing work down in New Mexico on a different project. You can see she's standing down in this excavation unit, and the first 2 feet of this excavation is completely built up soils out of trash. Ash lenses, coal lenses, and various parts of debris that they were cleaning out of stuff. And they're sprinkling across their landscape, just like people used to do in their backyards in downtown St. Paul, and building up over time that landscape. So what that tells us is that the Native American archaeology is much deeper buried in a lot of places, especially on the bluff edge, and it's been covered over and sealed in a lot of ways and protected from other kinds of construction and demolition activities that are impacting the historic fort layers. And so that's really what we've been learning throughout this entire process. So I'll, of course, have much more on this once the fort work finishes and we get through processing this winter, all the interesting types of artifacts that we've been finding. And I'm sure I'll have the opportunity to give another talk once the project is all done. But I want to wrap up by saying the fort is an active construction site. In order to be on the site, when you're working out there, you can see lots and lots and lots of my pictures. You have to have a hard hat on, you have to have safety equipment on, safety glasses on, masks if you're inside the buildings. The fort is not safe to be at right now. It will become a safe place where people can live and have amazing new stories to go with the old stories that have always been there for thousands of years, and when Native Americans were first there, and when Euro-Americans came over the landscape. But currently it is not a safe place. I don't recommend visiting the construction site. It's dangerous. But once it is done and it's reopened to the public, it'll be a wonderful place to go and see. And that essentially concludes my talk, and we'll have time here now for questions. So I will stop sharing the screen, hopefully. There we go. And I'll open it up with Robin leading the questions. She'll be reading the questions out of the chat, and then I will do my best to answer them.
So as Jeremy said, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And Todd had a question about, is there a timeline when the project will be complete?
There is a timeline, and maybe I'm going to go back and share my screen again and go back into some stuff here. The timeline, of course, is that it won't be anytime soon. Let me go back to this first slide that showed the construction process. So here we go. So the construction process is actually operating in 3 phases. This is phase 1, which is infantry barracks and work over here. This is headquarters building. This is where a lot of the shots I was just talking about were happening right here. Phase 2 is this administration area called Hospital Row. And then over here is Officers Row. And so the first two phases are currently underway. So all of the masonry, external masonry work, internal construction and demolition work, roofing work, and things like that is all happening right here. The first building that's going to be open is going to be the leasing office. It's going to be right here. I think that's scheduled to be open next year. And then they'll have, in 2022, they'll have a couple other of the buildings open. But this is going to be a 2023, 2024 kind of process. It's going to take years. And some of the buildings are currently not even going to be part of the first run, if you will, of buildings. A lot of stuff that's closer to the airport and the old bakery building that's down here, those are currently just being stabilized so they can be winterized. And then there'll be some of the last places that get turned into housing. But that's an excellent question.
So Krista had a question about if there's a ballpark figure for the total cost of the project. Now, obviously, if it's going to continue for several more years, that's going to change, but.
Right, and I have no idea what the cost of the project is. I honestly do not. I'm not I don't know I don't know anything about the overall large numbers of the project. I only know my archaeology budget, and that's it. So I don't know the overall large number. I apologize.
So Jeremy, can you just spend a couple minutes and maybe Matt can help out too, and tell us a little bit about any of the prep work that you had to do. Obviously those plans that Matt showed that you had, that Matt found, the blueprint. What other prep work did you have to do before you actually got on site?
Right. Well, most of the time what we do is something called a literature review. So in a literature review, we start by learning what other archaeologists have done out at the site. So we learned that, again, this is the upper post area that we've been doing most of our work in. We learned that after the, I'm going to move to the next slide here. After the airport had been constructed, there was a proposed plan to actually have the airport have another runway that was going to go in over this direction. And so Christina Harrison, a well-known archaeologist here in working, she just died a couple of years ago, unfortunately. She did a series of archaeological investigations right along the bluff edge. And she was actually, her and John Strott were the first two individuals to find the archaic component that was along this edge. So we first do research to see what kinds of previous archaeological work has been done. And then we do a lot of research to figure out what was there previously below ground. So the buildings that are no longer above ground and the ones that are not standing anymore, those are the things we focus on. So architectural historians, they're the ones that are really keen on the above ground standing structures. And we've had a great partnership with Hess Royce. They're the ones that have been doing all of the architectural historical work. But for archaeologists, we're really concerned and interested in the buildings that are no longer above ground. Are there foundations for those? Have those foundations been damaged or destroyed over time? Are there portions of those that are left that could tell us information about the people and the lives that were led on this portion of the fort? And that's the things that we ask a lot of questions around, and we get archivists and historians and others involved. And luckily, we've been able to have Matt Pfluger involved on the project. Anyone who has information about them by not only historic accounts like these quartermasters reports, but also accounts from when the VA was doing and operating out there. And then even later after that, Minnesota Historical Society doing work. We do all of that as something called a literature review first. But then as an archaeologist, my first thing that I do out on site is I start doing these shovel tests. So I do a lot of documentary work ahead of time, but the landscape itself has changed so much over time. Until you put shovels in the ground, you don't know really what you're going to find. So it is a combination of both documentary work, so that's historic accounts, inventories, maps, things like that, but then the archaeological record, both working in tandem to tell a more complete story about the fort. That's a good question.
So there was a question again, what input has the Native American community had into the project, and what are their thoughts about it?
Sure. So throughout the entire process, because the Department of Natural Resources is the manager at the state level for this, we have gone through a Native American consultation process. So all my archaeological work along the way has been reported back to tribes. They have had the opportunity to consult out on the site. When I was doing the work at Lower Post, we actually had Native American archaeological monitors come out to site. Anastasia Wolhoff, one of the individuals that I showed you a picture of before, is actually a tribal member out there doing archaeology with us. So we've had input from them. We had more input on Lower Post right at the confluence in the Badote area. In the Upper Post area, since most of the development activity that's going on is away from the bluff edge and is more focused on the Euro-American buildings, they have had less interest in direct consultation with that process. But when we do things along the bluff edge, that's when they're the most interested, and that's when we have shared lots of information about the archaic component that's still present. But unfortunately, because of the construction of those highway elements way back, 60 years ago, that was where most likely there was more of an archaeological component, Native American component that was present that's no longer present today. So we have had a great relationship with tribes doing the consultation process, sometimes having monitors out on site and also having archaeologists out there along with us. Good question.
Great question. So kind of leading off of that, how many people do you have on the site at any given time related to the archaeology?
So once upon a time, I had 10 to 12 people out there working with me when we were doing a lot of our phase 1 and phase 2 work. Now I have one archaeological monitor for each ground disturbing activity. So if there are 2 utility teams that are out working on a given day, I'll have 2 monitors for those, one for each of the activities. We've had up to 5 different ground disturbing activities happening at one time. And so we've had 5 archaeologists. Typically though, because the utility work, which is the major ground disturbing activity, needs a lot of people to do it, and it is a relatively slow process, I usually have 2 to 3 archaeologists out there at any one time.
And Todd also asked, people are already inquiring about renting the apartments. Where can he direct them?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer for that. I'm not involved with the renting of the property. I'm only involved with the archaeological component. I would think if you Google Upper Post Flats, which is the name of the development, there should be a website for you to do that, more of that interested in, but I unfortunately don't have an answer for that.
Okay, are there any other questions right now? Okay, we'll turn off the recording in a minute, and then you can feel free to unmute and we can talk. But again, thank you, Jeremy, for this great presentation. And I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. Please check out our website for upcoming programs, Gibbs Farm News, and a lot more. And we will have you back again whenever you're ready to come back and share more of the results. So again, thank you all for participating tonight, and we'll hope to see you at another program soon.
Great. And I want to say thank you too to everyone that's involved, my archaeological consultants that are out there, but also Weiss builders, all the trades that are out on site, Dominium and the other leaseholders that are operating on site, and everyone who continues to work together collectively to make this a successful project. Thank you to everyone.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy.